Okay, so these are some of the techniques or steps to use in order. Body posturing is something that can be helpful. You can mimic their body posture. So if they take a certain position, if you take a very similar position, it's subconscious, it's unconscious, but it makes them feel more at ease. And respect their personal space. So how many people have been in an elevator? Raise your hand if you've been in an elevator. Okay. What happens when you get in an elevator with 5 other people? Can you use a microphone, please?
You realize that everyone is about their stuff. No one cares about the other. So some people are doing different tasks. Some are listening to like headphones. Some are on their phones. So that's the thing.
Right. We're all very close to each other, and it feels a little bit uncomfortable, right? So you look at your phone, you look up, you look at the numbers on the panel, right? Because we're too close to each other. If you're right here next to your client, they're going to feel, why is this person so close to me? And they'll feel a little bit threatened by it. So have a comfortable space between you and the client so that you respect their personal space. So I want to talk about fairly briefly a few sort of special circumstances. And that's interviewing victims of torture or trauma, interviewing a mentally ill person, and interviewing someone charged with a gender-based violence. I guess a couple of things. One is a lot of us have a tendency when we hear someone talk about something very traumatic, which torture certainly would be, to say, oh, I know how you feel. And that generally isn't a good response to people when people reveal something like this to you, because their reaction generally is going to be, there is no way you can know how I feel. Unless you experience the very same thing that I experienced, you can't know how I feel. Or unless you were me, because we're all different, we're all individuals, we all respond to things in a different way. So instead of saying, I know how you feel, you can use some of the questions that we talked about earlier. You could say, well, tell me how that makes you feel. Help me to understand what that means to you. And you have to not judge and have respect for the feelings that they have about that, even if they might not be the feelings you would have in a similar circumstance, because they're individual people who reacted to this situation as only they would react, and you have to respect that. Okay, so if people have been tortured or experienced trauma or are mentally ill, these are some of the symptoms that you might see. They might have what's called a flat affect. That is, they might not demonstrate very much emotion. They'll be withdrawn or quiet. The opposite could happen. They might get hyperactive. They might move around a lot, fidget, talk very quickly. So these are things to look for. And if they're detached from reality, that's another symptom, and you'll recognize that right away, I think, right? That's usually pretty obvious to people. So these are things to look for as clues that your client might have a mental health problem or have experienced trauma. Now, when you're interviewing people who have had these experiences, these are some of the techniques you can use, okay? They're going to be probably less likely to want to talk to you about these things than somebody who hasn't had those experiences. So you have to be patient and take the time to build a relationship of trust with them. raise the issues only when they're ready to talk about them. If they indicate to you, as I said earlier, that they're not ready, then that's okay. Okay, we'll come back to that at another time. Follow the client's lead. Let the client speak. Listen to them carefully and respond in an appropriate way that doesn't push them. If they've experienced physical, psychological torture or trauma, then you eventually, when they're ready for it, you need to get the details of it, about that, what information. What was the degree of the harm? What was the degree of the torture? What was the degree of the trauma? And include other people if necessary or helpful. If family members can be helpful in allowing you to obtain information from the client, then make use of that. If you need to have a mental health expert, somebody like Sophie involved, then try to get them involved either through a court order or in some fashion. So I said earlier, some people may react differently when they have some of these conditions, and they may be hyperactive. And what I wrote here is let them purge. That is, let them talk, let them go, let them say what they want to say. It's a venting for them, and it's helpful for them to do it. And you may actually get some very helpful information. When they've finished venting, then try to sort of help them calm down a little bit and get focused on the details that you need. Explain why you need the information and how you might use it. So there might be a mental health defense in the case. And you want them to understand why you're asking these questions, because these questions are intrusive. They're about things that are very personal. So you want them to feel comfortable and understand why you need it. This is the same as I said earlier, sort of follow their lead. Again, clarify the degrees of trauma and help get others involved if they can help you. How am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, so if they're detached from reality, again, I think this is something that you'll recognize right away. If they start saying things that indicate that they're hallucinating, that they have no idea what's going on in the real world, you're going to recognize that. So some of the issues are some people who have those kind of symptoms have periods when they're lucid, have periods when they are focused on reality. So if you can figure out whether they're in that state at a particular time or whether they tend at a certain time of day to be in that state, then try to have a meeting with them when they're going to be lucid and attached to reality. If they need medications, that's something you should try to see if they can get, so that you can help them be in a lucid state, and they'll be able to help you with their defense more readily. And again, get help from a mental health professional if that's needed and you're able to do it. And you have to make a decision about whether they may be incompetent to proceed. I assume you all have this in your law, that if a person's incompetent, they can't be tried. Right? And you have to make a decision about that and then move forward appropriately. I think for victims of torture, you need to get the relevant information, the time and place that it happened, what people were there, who was present, what were their roles, what did each person do, identify any possible witnesses, get details about the nature of the torture or abuse, document any marks or injuries, either in writing, by photographs, or by records from a hospital or whatever, and an examination by a doctor if you're able to get that done. I think somebody over here yesterday talked about how they experiences where somebody had been beaten and they wouldn't take him to the hospital, and I think you have a responsibility then, I think, if they won't, to go to the court and get an order directing them to take him to a hospital and get examined and allow you to take photographs of the injuries. So I think two things if you have a client charged with gender-based violence, and one is to make sure that they understand and clarify for them what the legal situation is and what the roles of the people involved are. It's important for all clients to always understand that in any case, but in these gender-based cases, I think it's especially important. And then address any cultural or social understanding or misunderstanding about gender-based violence. What if people think that somehow it's appropriate, that you have to try to address that in a fashion that makes the client understand that this society, with the laws that it has determined that it's not appropriate, and how you have to deal with their defense in light of that. I think Valerie yesterday talked some about this, and the truth is different for different people, and it's not always essential that you ask the client for the truth, right? What you want to do is be helpful in trying to understand with the client where they are, how they got to where they are, and so you're finding the truth of the circumstances that they're in, because their truth may be different than your truth, but the truth of the circumstances that they're in is something that you can work with the client on to discover. This is just a summary of some of the helpful sort of questions or phrases that I think you can use. What was it like? How did that feel? Please tell me more. Help me to understand. These 4 phrases can be really helpful in interviewing clients. So now, just to summarize, that you need to build trust with your client, and that may take some time. You can't do it in 1 meeting. You probably can't do it in 2. You're going to need to spend time with the client to build trust. Treat them respectfully, communicate with them, do what you say you're going to do so that they have confidence in you. Ask open-ended questions so that they can give broad, expansive answers. Use affirmations and reflections so that they know that you're listening and they can clarify mistakes or inaccuracies. And summarize for the same reasons. Okay, so investigation, I'm just going to talk about very briefly. I clearly, I'm not an expert on Rwandan law, and our system when it comes to investigation in the U.S. is very different. The defense can investigate the case separately on their own. They don't rely on the police or the prosecutorial investigation. They can investigate it separately. They can go to the crime scene and take photographs. They can go out and interview witnesses and so on. That's not the system that you have. So I looked at some of your legal provisions, and I talked with JB and Valerie about it a little bit, but I'm far from an expert. So the ideas that I'm going to express are just things for you to think about as possibilities and discuss among yourselves about whether you might be able to do them. This slide is about some of the constitutional and international provisions that I think are a foundation for some of the suggestions I have. I'm not going to spend time on it. Jacques covered this in more detail and more thoroughly yesterday, so I'm just going to kind of skip over it. So critical investigation is obviously the client interviews, which is something you can do here and you have to do. That's the beginning of your investigation. You will often learn things from the client that, in our experience, require follow-up. They may tell you things that you want more information about. Now, I guess you have to rely on waiting to get some information from the prosecutor, but I think if the prosecutor gives you information and something that the client told you isn't apparent in that information, then you want to be able to do some kind of follow-up, and I'll talk a little bit about some ideas I have that you might be able to do, but you'll have to sort of among yourselves figure that out. You obviously have to obtain documents related to the case, which the prosecutor, I understand, is supposed to give you. I think if you look at the documentation and it's apparent that something's missing, like in this hypothetical that we have, it says that there were a number of other statements, but when you get the paperwork, they're not there. Then you have to follow up on that and try to get the other documentation. You can make a request of the prosecution, and if the prosecution isn't cooperative, you can ask the court to order them to provide the information. The scene of the crime, I mean, I'm not sure how that works here. I know that the police and the prosecutors go to the scene of the crime and do investigation, and there are provisions in your criminal procedure code that allow you to make certain requests, and I wonder if you could request of the prosecution that if you think there's information from the scene that they didn't obtain, that you ask them to get it or ask the court to order them to get it. Like, for instance, video. In America, there's video in so many places, security cameras and whatever, and all the time in legal cases, we're getting a hold of it to see what's on it. So that's just one example. Forensic evidence and experts. You have some provisions, I think, where the police can, I guess, hire experts. I think if you're in a situation where you think an expert is needed, then you should make a request to have one appointed for mental health reasons, identification evidence, cause of death, or whatever. These are some of the criminal provision codes that I think support some of these requests. So this is the legal authority you could cite for some of these requests. That you could ask the police. Well, I think JB told me you really can't ask the police to do it, so you would have to ask the prosecutor, I guess, to do it. The prosecutor can issue summons and warrants. You could ask for that. You can request the evidence be preserved. You can request the court to order the evidence be tendered. So if there's evidence that you're aware of that the prosecution hasn't identified, then you can ask the court to have that be tendered. And you can request confrontation between accused persons, witnesses, or witnesses and accused persons. So those are all legal authorities for some additional investigation or information that you can try to discover. That's it. So, are there any questions, comments?
Yes, I have a question about managing on the issue of listening while you are interviewing the clients, about managing interviewing and emotions. Because in some cases you may get a client about while he's recalling his story, you may be shocked, you may have emotions. So in some cases it would be advisable to a defense to give up because he's not managed to manage his emotions, or two, if for example, because for example I'm a man, an advocate lawyer, and I'm hearing to the client who were raped, for example. So while I was interviewing the client, is not comfortable to record the whole history. So in that case, is it advisable in, for example, because of course the first step would be to build that trust, but along the discussion, it seems that I'm failing to get that trust from my client. Is it also advisable to give up the case? Thank you.
Okay, so that's a great question, and it's related to some of the discussion that we had yesterday in the gender issues. I think first, never give up. You never give up. If the client gets very emotional, and first, I think you try some techniques to try to calm them down and get them focused by saying, I know that must be difficult for you, or are you able to talk about it now? Do you think you can calm down enough to give me some information about it? If they're not able to at that point, as I said earlier, then just say, okay, that's all right. We won't talk about that now. Let's go on and talk about something else. And as you develop more of a relationship with them, come back to it in another visit. If, like for instance, the example you gave of you're a male and you're interviewing someone about rape, are you referring to this is a female you're interviewing? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's a difficult situation, and I'll come to you in just a second. Okay. So it's in some ways related to the conversation we had yesterday about who is best suited to represent a male or a female or whatever. And I think, I guess my answer to that question is both genders can represent the other gender. But that doesn't mean that in every case you're the best person for that female client. It may be that female client is going to be much more comfortable talking to another female, another lawyer, or a female mental health professional or whatever. So that's why when I said earlier, if necessary, bring somebody else in, I think that's a circumstance where you would do that. You can ask a female colleague to go and interview them. If you think it requires a psychologist or a mental health professional, then have the mental health professional do it. So I think you have to make decisions about these issues of what's the best way to represent your client on an individual case-by-case basis. And don't think that if you're unable to get the information, you either should quit or that you're not competent. It just means there's a circumstance in which somebody else is better suited to help that client along with you. That would be my answer. And you had a comment?
Murakoze. Mfite ikibazo ku birebana no gushaka amakuru aho mwagaragaje ko
Hold on. Okay, can you start over, please? Yes.
mfite ikibazo kirebana n'uburyo bwo gushaka amakuru aho mwasobanuye muganisha ko umwavoka nawe yaba ari mu bantu bashaka amakuru arebana n'umukiriya we. Hanyuma uburyo amategeko yacu ateye tuzi ko gushaka amakuru bireba umugenzacyaha ndetse n'umushinjacyaha, ariko rimwe na rimwe mu makesi duhura nayo ugasanga natwe hari igihe batubwira ngo nitwe twagombaga gushaka amakuru arebana n'ikibazo mu nyungu z'umukiriya wacu. Nagira ngo mbabaze, ese mwebwe mu mategeko yanyu yo mu gihugu cyanyu hari ingingo zaba ziteganya ko umwavoka agomba gushaka amakuru mu nyungu z'umukiriya we kugira ngo agere ku kuri? Nicyo kibazo nari mfite. Murakoze.
Okay, yeah, so in our system, there aren't really laws that say that we can do it. It's just been the common practice for 250 years. That part of your constitutional right to a defense is that your lawyer can investigate. And usually the lawyer doesn't do it him or herself. They usually, in our federal public defender offices or our state public defender offices, they have investigators on their staff who go out and interview people and take photographs of crime scenes and whatever. So it's been the practice in the U.S. since the country was founded, so we're allowed to do it. And I wasn't trying to suggest that the lawyers here do the investigation themselves. It sounds to me like that's not possible in your system. But I think there are provisions in your code of procedure that could allow you to ask the prosecutor to go seek information or ask the court to order the prosecutor to go get the information. But that's something, I think you all should discuss among yourselves. And I would suggest trying it if you haven't tried it, because what can they do? They can say no, right? And you're no worse off if they say no. But if they say yes, you're helping your client in a big, big way. Anything else? Yes.
I want to ask a question relating to the client, where interviewing the client and refrain from saying anything about his case. which techniques, the best one that you can use to get information in regard to that client.
The best techniques to get information related to a particular issue?
While we are interviewing the client, and the client refrain from saying anything about his case, the best technique that you can use.
Okay. So I think, yeah, that's difficult. And occasionally you do get clients who don't want to talk at all. And that can be very difficult. I think the first point is that you have to keep working to develop trust. So it's some of the things I think that you can do if they're not willing to talk at all is tell them I'm going to do A, B, and C, and then go out and do A, B, and C, and make sure that they're aware that you did it by sending them a copy of a document that you prepared or filed or whatever, so that they will develop confidence in you, and that may allow them to have the trust to speak to you more. Make sure you explain clearly your role and how you may be able to help them so that they understand that you're not an adversary, that you're there to assist them. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we need other people to help us. If a family member is better able to explain to them that you're in a position to help them and they'll trust that person more, maybe get the family member to talk to them and then try to interview them again. Those are some of the suggestions I would have. Okay, one more? Okay, one more.
Thank you. We have listened how we can be attentional, careful to listen our clients. But the problem I have, the time management. There is some client who want to spend all time with his lawyer. He want to remind you every day about his case. So how can you manage this client? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, that's that's another difficult problem. But I think that's part of the conversation that you have about expectations, right? That's why I suggested ask them what their expectations are. And sometimes they don't express them as well as you would like, and it becomes apparent that their expectations are greater than your time allows. And so I think you have to explain to them, you know, they are not your only client. You have other clients and you have other responsibilities, but that you're invested in their case is important to you, and you want to try to work with them and stay focused on the issues that are important to the case so that they don't dominate your time. But you can't give up on them. You have to try to work with them to explain and have them develop a realistic expectation of what you can do for them and how much time you can spend with them. Okay. All right, thank you.